Boom. We are live, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today. We have a great guest from a big time. We have Matt Thwaites. I think I said that correctly. I have to double check. But Matt, how you doing today?
I'm doing well, and yeah, you got it right. Awesome.
So let's just dive right in. I'm new to the gaming sector, but a longtime fan of crypto for a bunch of reasons. But tell us a little bit about big time and your position there.
So Bigtime is a multiplayer RPG game. It's totally free to play. You basically roam a series of open worlds that we call timeshares, and then as you roam in these worlds, you drop into these procedurally generated dungeons. And when you go into these dungeons, that's where the enemy is turned on, and you go into like active combat mode. So you can run through the dungeons solo or have up to six people. The blockchain component of it is that we have cosmetic NFTs that get dropped as loot inside the game, and then players can buy, sell, trade them on our marketplace.
Well, of the timeshares, it maybe is a not a great name for saying timeshares, just has a bad track record of thoughts. But I like this
Yeah,
idea of kind of free to play and the discovery process of I guess what you're calling loot within the game. Can you tell
yeah.
us a little bit about the comparison of the free to play aspect versus buying the NFT ownership and how I guess gamers are looking at this?
Yeah, so in my perspective, you when you buy when you bought a cosmetic skin in other games previously, I would argue that you didn't truly own them. You would buy them from the game maker, and you could use them on your character, but you couldn't change them, you couldn't alter them, couldn't sell them, couldn't move them out of the game. So what we tried to do was make our cosmetics NFTs so that the users really do have control over that. And then with regards to us being a free to play game, we just really believe that the future of gaming involves kind of greater access. And so not only are is it free to play, but we're not really a pay to win game either. The NFTs don't give you a competitive advantage. So that's it makes those barriers to entry into the game a lot lower, which is what we think is more important for gamers, especially when we try and increase the number of people playing Web3 games.
I'm what's your background in gaming like?
I was very much a recreational gamer like growing up, but this is my first time working for a game company or a Web3 company.
In with big time and the NFTs, how are what's the company's thoughts on packaging IP and ownership of that IP within the character? Because for me, this seems like maybe one of the greatest net benefits. Because I've used this as an example a few times, but I'm an early adopter of a shit ton of really forward-thinking ideas. That's what I'm good at is being super early to think. So early, it's often illegal to have the same interest, but I look at something like South Park and think, okay, well, what if instead of just being launched through the comedy network, they did an NFT series and you got to buy the 10,000 characters within this? What happens if you end up owning Cartman's IP or something? How's Big Time thinking about ownership of IP of these individual characters?
The characters themselves are not they're not on chain, they're not NFTs for us. But the cosmetic and the appearances are. I mean, the biggest premise of why we have thing blockchain inside of our game is to give back identity and ownership back to the player, which is exactly what you just said. Like, give it back to them, give them more power, give them control over that IP. One of the features that's a big part of Big Time that's not released yet in our alpha is the ability to craft and make your own NFTs. So we have space. That's our land NFT, which aesthetically looks like a house or a castle. It's your own area, but the the supply side of cosmetics in Big Time very much comes from other players, people who own this space, who own and make those items by crafting it inside the game and then sell it to other players. So that's the kind of decentralized IP distribution portion of it.
So we've seen a few. I was watching the other side demo the other day. Can you tell us a little bit about the technology that underlies this process between both the game front end, I guess, and the blockchain back end?
Yeah, so we did a couple of NFT sales already, and for the big ones we did were in December and March. Those were our land sales, and the land is essentially a decentralized. Space is a decentralized land NFT, which is not an oxymoron. It's basically your own private area that you can retreat back to, and you can invite other players into it. That's where you take those base layer NFTs that are inside the game, along with those other in-game items you find inside, like gold and gems. You essentially combine them together in a type of recipe, and then you can sell those on the marketplace, or you can use them on your character. So that's kind of like the production standpoint of it. The other key part about the blockchain in Bigtime is we have this technology called the vault, where most of the transactions and the NFTs inside the game are off chain. But when you want to move those NFTs outside of the game, you can mint them onto a variety of different chains, which is what you can use the vault for. And so by doing that, by essentially having our own marketplace, we can make it more accessible for Web2 gamers who can sign up for Bigtime only using a Google account and a credit card.
And is the front end built on Unity or Unreal Engine? Is it your guys' own kind of
Unreal Engine
SDK?
4.
And then for the production of in-game assets, is there a built-in SDK or like a package that each player is given to kind of build the assets? How is that? How are those assets generated within the game itself?
You're talking about, so they can come from either in-game drops, and there's like some preset ones that are already out there, and they get dropped randomly. In terms of the upgrading and crafting it that way it looks from a user interface standpoint is you find these other resources and combine them, and it's almost like different formulas. The best analogy I have is like cooking. It's like the different ingredients that you combine together with that base layer NFT will elevate it to a higher level or increase its rarity, and depending on what those inputs are will dictate what the output is.
So, part of my interest here too is trying to understand. I think predominantly like why we're here, why we're invested in the sector is because we think it's an on ramp for a billion people that don't have access to traditional anything, maybe even identity. How is the character or community members' identity built in the background? What type of data and analytics systems are you guys working on to like track how much are they participating? How many hours they spend? Is there what type of, yeah, I guess analytic and engagement tracking is going on in the background to have to build like the identity of a character without knowing who that person is?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways I think you can kind of look at that. It's a little bit challenging right now for us to get a holistic picture of everybody involved in Bigtime because we're relatively limited in the number of players inside the game. We're still in early access, and we're at about 20,000 passes to get into the game right now, but that's not necessarily representative of all the people who want to play Bigtime, right? We have 400,000 people in the Discord, and we only have about 20,000 passes that are out there right now. But what we do watch very heavily, like everybody else, is daily active user rates and then retention rates after that. And what we've generally noticed is that, especially through those early access pass periods where people were paying, for example, up to $8,000, $9,000 for these gold passes, that the retention rate was extremely high. But what's challenging for us is that we're still in an alpha. We still need to build more content, and we still need to flesh out all these other features to keep people engaged. We do watch all of the kind of player interactions like very closely, but we're very concerned about making sure that when we do launch, we would almost rather delay it a little bit to make sure things that are not there's minimal number of bugs. It's a positive user experience. So when we do launch, there's nothing but positive interaction, and not really like a big pushback.
So, one of the things I found interesting too is this kind of actively building and developing. From what I've understood, is that most of the game development is very wall gardened in the past. You've got this huge separation between the people that are creating the game and then the end game's result. I think it was Cyberpunk 2020 or something supposed to be this awesome game. It just flopped. You spend hundreds of millions of dollars in the game, find out nobody even likes the game after you've produced it.
Yeah.
How's Big Time going about this interactive experience between growing the alpha, the beta versions of the game, and the community interaction?
There's a couple ways. I think first and foremost is we tend to be undermarketed, at least in my personal opinion. We tend to underhype and overdeliver. especially with the way we do our trailers and stuff like that. They are pulled almost entirely straight from gameplay. So what you see in those is almost exactly what you're going to get. And we are cognizant of knowing that like when you launch it, it better meet players' expectations. Otherwise, there's going to be that big pushback, like I just mentioned. I suppose what the biggest interaction we have right now is the loop between our players and their feedback in the forums and our developers. So we scrape and go through our forums every day, and we have a community huddle every day, and we look through all that feedback, and we generally are able to bucket it into about 8 to 10 different categories. And then from there, our developers attempt to recreate whatever that error was or the bug was, or they review footage of it and then fix it. And if they're not able to either see it or fix or replicate it, then it's a little bit more challenging. But I mean, we go through that pretty much every day, and we interact a ton with our community. Community management is probably the area that we've grown the most in Bigtime outside of like the actual development team, just to make sure we can have that positive feedback.
So with this kind of open development and communication between the community, what are some of the biggest hurdles that you guys need to overcome? Like where's the weakness right now? Like what's stopping the billion people from signing up and playing?
I think it's a general opposition to blockchain from, just colloquially what I refer to as the Web 2 population. And they have a variety of different problems with it. They think it's a Ponzi scheme, they think the games suck, and sometimes they're just not even willing to see or hear any more about Big Time, simply because there's NFTs somewhere mentioned in the description of the game. And that's been pretty hard, where it's like, hey, we're not like other blockchain games that are out there right now. We do look different. It is a very different user experience. Give it a shot. And that's been my personal biggest hurdle to try and overcome, is like, hey, give it a shot. At least take a look at this trailer. But it's not, but that's, I think, the biggest challenge, generally speaking, for Web3. There should be a billion more people in Web3, but for some reason or not, they have not made that transition.
Yeah, but we see this in technology or almost anything in general. There's actually one of my favorite quotes is from a Nobel Prize laureate who said it basically science evolves one funeral at a time. People become very, very cemented in their opinions and their views, especially as the world around them changes so quickly. Um,
Yeah.
I guess what are the main advantages then about this sector in your opinion as well? Like, a lot of us know that this offers the potential for ownership for something that you normally get nothing back from. What are some other less thought about areas that are the highlight?
I think the ability to play and earn at the same time is probably the most palatable feature to most people. I would argue that you don't really want to do play to earn, because that basically turns most games into a job, but the ability to play and earn, or play and own, is still super appealing to people. Some people are playing games recreationally for hours a day. Might as well have the ability to like own and earn from the assets if you want to. It's purely optional there. I think the other thing is that I very much view the technological benefits of Web3 as a stepping stone. It's almost the jump from Web 2 to Web 3 games is not a revolution so much as a progression, at least in my opinion. And it's like there's really no disadvantages to a lot of this stuff here. It's if incorporated properly. It just enhances gamer experience, it enhances user experience across the entire spectrum of what that means in GameFi. And so I really try and focus on that one. All those game development platforms for Web 2 are compatible with Web 3, but they give more back to the players.
No, one of the other interesting things here I'm trying to figure out is what the future looks like, and often we do that by trying to be reductionist, like what's not going to change. We know that we're still going to have 3 and 4-legged chairs, like chairs are going to be around in the future. What are we not going to have is one of the good ways to look at it. What do you think are some of the fluff areas that will get weeded out as time goes on? Like what's not valuable about this sector? Like yeah, does that make sense?
That's challenging. I think sacrificing gameplay for the sake of earnings is has a terminus on it, and it was very successful in through 2021 and into 2022. But I think there is a cap, a limit essentially of how many people are willing to do that and how far games can progress in that market or using that type of model. I think that the a very simple concept of that games must be fun. And if they are not fun, then people will not play them as games. They will play them as jobs if they play them at all. And so if you want
Is
to have a gamer
chess
experience,
fun?
but it sounds very simple. And, I think, people who are familiar with Web3 and GameFi projects can probably think of a few games off the top of their head that they're not fun experiences. And if you try and describe it to you or show them to somebody who's, for example, a Fortnite player or grew up playing Halo, it'd be like, hey, this is the future. They'll be like, I don't want anything to do with that future. That's not what I want. But in some ways, you have to kind of move back that way and be like, we need to incorporate those models and user experiences with having fun, and then adding the blockchain into it as opposed to trying to build blockchain with a spritzing game in it.
Yeah, it's one of those weird aspects because you've got the gaming sector traditionally, which kind of is a standalone, very valuable sector. And then you've got economy, IP, ownership, voting, and governance. Can you tell us a little bit about how Big Time is looking at the economy of itself and the governance structure?
We're doing something a little bit different. We didn't have an initial token sale, no IDO, no IDC, and then we don't have a governance token. Our token, somewhat controversially, is just going to be earned from in-game play. And so like not even the CEO or myself are getting any token from Bigtime prior to the launch of the game. We have to grind to get it. And that's a pretty big divergence from a lot of games that are coming out now or have launched in the past couple years. The other part is the economy. The economy was secondary to gameplay. So we built a game. We are still building a game. We are adding more content into it. And the economy will support that game and enhance that game experience. It wasn't the other way around. It wasn't build a great economy and then try and add a game into it. And it sounds like a trite difference, but from a user experience level, it will mean quite a bit. We've been somewhat careful with the way that we release information about our economy. Right now in our alpha, it's a very simplistic economy. If you find NFTs, you can sell them, you can trade them, you can buy them, and that's about it. But when you go into the crafting and the upgrading part of the economy, that's where we have to make sure it's going. We're more deliberate about it because once we kind of hit launch on that, the game, it's hard to get it back and to make major adjustments. What we generally keep in mind is that it can't contribute to a pay to win environment and it can't detract from the fun and immersive part of the experience, but should always be player run. Like Bigtime will never sell a cosmetic skin. It's always going to come from players. And that's very important. But when we do it, we have to make sure that it incentivizes people to stay inside the game. So if you don't create a fun and immersive game that people are ready and willing to spend, kind of hours of their day on, then that economy is going to fall apart.
This is one of the weird parts to me is that we're venture capitalists. It's how we ended up here by accident, more or less, being able to find fringe ideas early and find an investment strategy to get in there. With no initial offering or token demonstration, you guys raised equity capital. How is the participant rewarded for the growth of Bigtime if they're not necessarily rewarded for the growth of the economy or the IP in general then?
It was through our space sales and land, so that's how we did it. So if you go back to September through November of 2021, we did a guild round there where some of the larger guilds kind of bought in at various amounts, and that raised about $11 million or so. And then we had a space sale again in December, and then again in late March, early April timeframe. And so it goes back to the space is the foundational part of our economy. The NFT drop rates and the cosmetic drop rates were relatively high during early access. They're going to get lower. And the main way that you're going to supply NFTs into the economy in the future is through space, through making your own. And the only way to collect that in-game token is through having space and a couple other NFTs enabled inside of your space. Like that's the only way that you can collect that token. So that's the incentive there. From like a micro econ kind of standpoint, we generally view that about 60-70% of players, are just going to play the game and not spend anything inside of it. But like 20 to 30%, somewhere in there, are going to want to have some sort of cosmetic skin. That's similar to what we've seen in other MMOs. And then that remaining 10% or so is really the guilds or guild-like type players who are out there finding NFTs, upgrading them, and then selling to those other people who demand them. They're the supply side. Those are generally the space owners. So they're the supply, and then those other people who want cosmetics are the demand. So that rewards kind of both sides for the growth of the game.
Okay, yeah, because one of the things that's been the most fascinating part about this whole sector is the early participation rewards and the asymmetric potential
Mm,
for participating early. I thought originally back in 2017 that post to earn things like Steam It were going to lead the way, but social media is far too like you've got Twitter, Facebook, YouTube is like whereas the gaming sector you have these kind of one-offs like Stardew Valley that just kick from single developer standpoint. So it seems like it's not as sectioned off as the what I thought was going to be the leader, which was supposed to earn. Like, how are the participants rewarded for the net benefit of the growth of the brand? Being the reason that the brand grows is generally them. They tell a friend, their friends start playing with friends, other friends start playing. And the network effect, usually participants are not rewarded in like you own nothing of Facebook. And
yeah,
most people around the world were never able to buy Facebook or Twitter or Netflix stock because they
yeah.
didn't meet the financial requirements or the identity requirements. And to me, that's what I find most fascinating about this sector is how do you get the potential for asymmetric growth into someone in rural Rwanda who happens to find a game or an idea early and participates in that brand development. And so I think that's such an important feature. We saw it with airdrops from Uniswap or the ENS tokens. Like you buy a $30 domain name and you get $15,000 in tokens dropped to you. It's just an absurdity. Like there's no way for the average person to participate like that, and most people are kind of, I guess, sanctioned out of it. I think my main interest is like how do you get that to happen for people? And we saw it with Splinterlands. We saw there's a
Mm,
few, like I saw a few kids make of like $1 million with Splinterlands. Just I'm sure it's worth much less now today, but it just that potential for asymmetric growth, I think, is such a valuable lesson because so many people are excluded from participating in early development. You've got companies that do billions of dollars of venture raising before they ever go public. The public is basically the rug. Like everyone's like, great, we've done enough to basically rug the public on an IPO after they've gone to like a $60 billion valuation in the back end. It's just absurdity. And there's the reason why these companies are worth anything is because people play them. The average person plays them. Again, with Cyberpunk, you spend all this money in a game, nobody plays the game. Well, it's worthless. It's a worthless game, basically. Um, so that to me is really interesting. How is Bigtime looking at the overall reward for participants for the I guess that back end, how much time, devotion, contribution that they're giving to the game? Is it just strictly through the marketplace or
yeah, there's a couple ways I suppose we can answer that. And in no, first of all, is there are a strongly increasing returns to larger guilds or guild type factions, right? So when you play with more people, you can find more NFTs. So like if you're in it for nothing other than just finding a lot of cosmetics and really just kind of running through the dungeons and being the top ranked team, you want a lot of people to play with and you want them to be top ranked players. The more experienced you are, the more people you play with, the higher your NFT drop rate is, which is great, right? So there are increasing returns there. Almost think of it like a sports team. Like you want to find the best recruited athletes like to be on your sports team, then you're going to want to do that. The second part is we generally work very closely with people who play the game. So if you're logging a lot of hours right now, we do a lot to reach out to you. That's a big part of what I do is find out like how to reward content creators. Like, hey, you know what? You're going to get X number of early access passes for all the great work you've been doing in Bigtime from streaming or playing or whatever it is. I want you to bring in a few of your friends more. So that's a big part of what I do. In terms of the just systemic incentives, I think it's important to kind of realize the relative size of Web3 games to Web2 games, because everybody kind of benefits when you have more people playing the game. In perspective, Axie at its peak had around 2 to 2.5 million daily active users. The 10th largest MMO is Star Citizen, and they have, excuse me, Axie had 2.5 million monthly active users. Star Citizen had 15 million monthly active users. So the biggest Web3 game by far at its peak was still 1/6 as big as the 10th largest MMO. So we're just in a different realm. So when you talk about like growing the gaming population and like the sustainabilities of these economies, you want a lot of players. And we're not even in the right like order of magnitude right now for Web3 to kind of say they're competing with Web2. So when we want to reward people like what you're saying, there are strongly increasing, benefits to having a lot of players inside the game, particularly if you own something like space and you are the one finding those NFTs early and then selling them to people.
And where does one get space?
So you can find it either from in-game play, it's pretty rare, or you can get it on our open market, essentially from other
On
users right now.
OpenSea or directly on your website?
On our website, yeah, nft.bigtime.gg.
And what about, so you can't get any of this on OpenSea? Is that because of the
Not
way the
yet.
NFTs are curated? Okay.
Yeah,
And
that will be one of the features where like that just comes with global launch where you can move it onto OpenSea. Yeah.
yeah, because this was one of the other parts of at least the economic conversation we found so fascinating. Is that just the decentralized nature of any economy, like Uniswap, basically, or Ether Delta, way back in 2017, it changed the world forever. People just slow to catch up. It's kind of similar to the digital camera. It just takes a while for people to recognize what's actually happened.
Yeah.
One of the questions that we like to ask is, what one thing in this sector are you like dead set on that most people disagree with you with at this point?
Token. The token, the initial either how we're using our token, what we did or didn't do with it, IDO, IDC, governance. That's probably the biggest thing I have found as pushback from your Web3 population. They're like, where is this token sale? I'm like, it's not going to happen. And some of that is just kind of personal preference of, if you want to kind of take, ownership of a part of Bigtime is through space. There is a fixed quantity of space. But also we just generally felt like the token model just did not lend itself well to either a sustainable economy or something that really incentivized players to keep playing. In fact, it tended to incentivize extraction from the game, which puts a ton of pressure on trying to balance the game later on and on the game company itself later on. That's probably the biggest thing I get back from a Web3 player population.
Yeah, everyone. Again, this kind of idea, I don't think I've ever heard so many people talk about venture capital as the last few years. It's become much more well known that early participation is usually the most rewarding. Um, One of the things I'm interested in here too, as well, is interoperability between
Mm.
games and in-game assets. I don't know a ton about Unreal Engine, but they're all different coding structures, right? Like it's hard to take assets from one game into the next. How are you thinking, or is Bigtime thinking about interoperability between other spaces and other games as well?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, we launched Big Time as a game to fall within the banner of Big Time Studios. So, the idea is that Big Time would probably not be the last game to come out from Big Time Studios. So, obviously, interoperability within the same studios is not outside the realm of possibility. Fortunately, Unreal Engine 4 has backwards compatibility with Unreal Engine 5, which is just came out here, I think, publicly a few months ago too. And if I've seen many kind of like metaverse projects like trying to launch off of Unreal Engine 5. So I mean, there's an appeal right there. There are some very strong technical difficulties of having that interoperability with Unity and other platforms like you just mentioned. But fortunately, Unreal Engine is a huge part of the gaming market. So like you can easily segue things in to other platforms that way. Additionally, I guess in the kind of more near term, the the easiest way for interoperability with the blockchain part is you're able to move things from our marketplace or inside of our game onto a variety of different chains. So if games are built on Ethereum or Polygon or whatever their chain they may be built on, you're going to be able to mint NFTs in big time onto another chain to the point where we would describe ourselves as chain agnostic. And then you can burn those same items into another game.
Do you feel that the chain agnostic route here might dilute the marketplace for where one would acquire or sell an asset within the game itself?
Um, I do. I would say that a fairly significant problem right now is games trying to figure out which chain to build their chain on, or to build their game on. It's hard because there's pluses and minuses to a variety of them, and it's probably similar to kind of where we were at with like cryptocurrency, where there were so many, and there are still so many. Like, which one is going to be the one that kind of survives here over the next 5 to 10 years or so? In the short term, I think that will be an issue, but I think as increasingly people get creative with how they work around that, whether it's Immutable X or something like the Vault or Layer Zero or Layer Two solutions, that's going to eventually kind of decrease those number of choices and make it a little bit easier for game developers to just build a high quality experience without spending as much time about worrying which chain to build it on.
And I guess we'll roll into the end here. We'll keep it short for today. What are some like final thoughts? What's the future look like?
What does the future look like? I, from a big time standpoint, I mean, we've kind of released our standpoint, or excuse me, our timeline of what we want to do, right? We're in an alpha. We're going to move to a place where you can start setting up your space and your land NFTs, then an invite only beta, and then an open beta eventually. But I think that's somewhat kind of more myopic of what you're asking about. I don't know. I think generally speaking, there's going to be a big movement towards Web3, but I think the AAA game studios are going to experiment and kind of put a toe into the water, maybe even an entire foot with how they're going to incorporate blockchain. But I think every game is going to eventually move towards blockchain in some way. And then in the longer indefinite term, I think that gamers or game development studios are probably the best conduit we have into the metaverse or whatever that ends up looking like. I think when people kind of mentally envision their version of a metaverse, I think they have a pretty hard time dissociating that from whatever large game studios are able to put together and the way they envision it as well.
The big companies are usually slower to adopt and recognize it. You've got so many examples of this in past. Kodak is one we use fairly frequently. You have the R&D team bringing you the digital camera, and you're like, nah, we're not into that kind of jam. Like, I think a lot of the times it's because they already have a profitable business model and they have a hard time navigating the legal. I guess what we're here to maybe even let's discuss some of the legal
Mm,
conversations around assets. I'm a strong proponent of all of this being product. I think a token, the utility within a game, is a product of the company, not so much a security. I give a clear argument in my viewpoint, at least, for these things being products.
mm.
How does Big Time look at the legal conversation around asset ownership? I guess as well.
Yeah, they're not securities, and this is not financial advice. That's for sure. The I guess more seriously, kind of addressing your point, the legal routes are difficult. And we're being diligent, not just of what kind of like the law states now, but where we anticipate it might go in the future, to just generally say like, hey, this is a game. This is an enjoyable user experience, and the way we kind of associate ourselves in in by identity ourselves is more along the lines of a game studio than like a play to earn job meta, security standpoint. So we always highlight the features of the game, that it's an enjoyable experience and you can make the in-game items yourself. It's not like necessarily like a way to make an income or something like that. It's challenging because a lot of people only ask about big time. They're like, "Hey, how do I make money and what's my hourly rate here if I play?" And that's perhaps the wrong way to kind of envision it. Nor do I think it's ultimately what they want in the game, because people who have that kind of mindset in large numbers put a ton of extraction value into the game, which in some way puts a sunset on how long the game can last. Something like World of Warcraft, right? It's been around for 20 something years because people like it for its inherent value. And there's a lot of money that exchanges somewhat in sometimes off market in somewhat illicit ways, but they play it and they spend money there because they want to use it inside the game. That's what we're trying to do, is as opposed to you can make money and extract it out of the game, think of it as a way to enhance your experience inside of Big Time and whatever games Big Time is ultimately connected to.
Yeah, one of the comparisons I try to make here too is with something like Netflix. And one of the downsides is, again, it's just regulation has kept most people away from participating.
Mm,
So therefore, most people are interested in an hourly idea instead of, well, what's the net benefit of the growth of a brand over 5 to 10 years? You spend $12 a month on Netflix for 5 years to get entertainment with nothing back. Whereas had you spent $12 every month for investing in Netflix, you'd end up with like $250,000 over the course of that 5 to 7 year period. So the downside here is, okay, well, the extraction comes from the benefit of the growth of the brand. So for the brand to grow, people need to like the game, which is
yeah.
kind of what you're saying. It's like the inherent initial step needs to be that people like the game so they show up and the brand grows. But ultimately, where people I think are still so disconnected from the potential here is what
Mm,
happens if you're right. We know from a venture capital standpoint, 97% of everything is going to fail miserably, even if it's awesome, right? Because people are fickle. I can't guess what people like. Like you play me Taylor Swift, no idea that people would like that. You play me Tool, on the other hand, like that's my jam. But so we see that there's this obvious disconnect between what becomes popular from a like almost let's say an intellectual standpoint. Like there's no clear intellectual reason or not always an intellectual reason why things become popular. But I think that net benefit, the potential for the growth is still what most Web 2 people don't recognize. They don't recognize that they've been cut out from the growth of a brand, even if
mm,
they're paying into it, right? Like, Netflix is kind of a fairly benign example because people are spending and they don't get any ownership over any of the movie titles effectively. But had they been able to, had they had some type of micro ownership where you could spend $24 a month instead of 12 to
yeah.
get that fractional stock put into your Netflix and you could go and trade it on an open market. These people are what they think is a normal hourly wage. They end up missing out on hundreds of thousands of or millions of dollars of upside growth due to the brand itself. And this is one of the conversations I think that's interesting. It's because, like you're saying, most gamers are coming from it from a standpoint where they're already spending this kind of unimportant amount of money. I've started playing Fortnite. I've bought a few skins. Like,
Yeah.
I was in there. It's like, oh, I was trying to find discs. I thought I still had to buy discs for the PlayStation. Like, was so disconnected. But for me, coming from a more financial background and investment, being early, what is most exciting is that asymmetric growth. How do you
Mm,
feel we communicate to people that asymmetric potential instead of just, because you're talking about the extraction benefit? Is if when your market gets big enough, it can handle the extraction, right? That's the downside. A lot of the times
yeah.
these games will launch an economy where the extraction side is not yet met. Like the supply and demand ratios are totally off. If someone's got growth, they're just going to sell. Part of it is the growth of the brands. This is kind of a long-winded question of how do we introduce some of the more valuable aspects about governance, IP ownership to the players who are more used to, I'm just going to spend money to have this cool looking thing in the game,
Yeah.
not recognizing that cool looking thing in the game. If it becomes a Cartman or it becomes one of these highly sought after brand or these IP ownership identities, this is where the real upside is. And that could take a decade to get there. How do we explain that more easily to people?
Honestly, I've used something similar like what you just said, right? You just brought up Fortnite. You're like, I've spent X amount of dollars on these Fortnite skins, and what can I do with them? And that's by user standpoint, Fortnite is gigantic, and so it's an anecdote a lot of people can recognize. It'll be like, did you buy a skin in Fortnite? Yeah, I bought some skins. How much? I don't know, $1,000. And I was like, what did you? So you generally probably bought one at like $10, then like 20, then like 50, then like 100, right? So you kind of stair stepped your way up. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I was like, and you only wear or use the most expensive one, right? He's like, yeah, pretty much. Like, what do you do with all the other ones? It's totally wasted, right? It's like, yeah, pretty much. I was like, well, imagine if you could just sell it and you could have bootstrapped your way into it. Because essentially, to get to that final NFT, that final skin that you're using, you had to accumulate all the costs of the previous ones. When in reality, you could have just been like, hey, I liked it. I'm going to sell it, get my value back, and then move on up. And so that people are like, oh, wow, I didn't think I could do that. Be like, yeah, well, there's no reason why you can't. Like in the market, this is all player run. It's very much player owned. Like I said, we don't sell any skins. They're just found inside the game, and all these transactions are player to player. So you have a significant more amount of ownership here. And when you kind of look at like the overall gaming space, it's like 50 to 60% of all MMO players spend money on cosmetics, right? No in-game utility whatever that is, whether it's a skin, an emote, they're already spending money, but I would argue you don't own those assets. But when you put them under blockchain or make them an NFT, you do own it, and you have a lot more ownership over it, and you can use it however you want.
Yeah, I'm sure if the legal conversation was clearer, the bigger game companies would be jumping into it because I'm sure they recognize by this point that the after sales market, it would provide a huge amount of extra revenue to them that they can't touch because they can just sell another game asset to a person that might not want to buy because it's more expensive. So you have this
Mhm.
whole secondary market or the potential in the increase in the value of those assets. I mean, Rolex is an example here where you can go buy a Fleet Protect for $50,000. You wait a few years, it ends up being worth a few $100,000, but they have no connection to that secondary market at all. It's all like
Yeah.
black market or whatever, like person to person or peer to peer sales that goes on. With
Mhm.
blockchain, they're able to write in this constant revenue generating process of secondary markets. I'm sure they would recognize the potential for a growth in revenue based off those secondary sales. Whereas if now it goes off chain, like you're saying, illicit or against the game's community guidelines to go and sell these things somewhere else. I
Yeah.
mean, I saw people getting paid. A friend of mine, box mining, he was selling, I think it was Doom skins or something, and he got his PayPal account blocked because of this. It was because it was went against their guidelines. But there's a huge secondary markets.
Yeah.
Well, Matt, it's been super engaging. Where can everybody find you and learn more about Big Time and participate in the game? Is it only on do I have to have a PC? Is it a in-game browser? Can I play it on iOS? What does this look like?
It's just PC for right now. The best way you can kind of like get your regular updates about Big Time is through Twitter. Um, Play Big Time, that's our handle. And then from there, that can get you into most of our other stuff. Um, if you want to start playing the game, nft.bigtime.gg, and then there is a play now button on there. You do need an early access pass, but we do work very closely with our engaged community members to get them into the game, like I just mentioned. And there are still some early access passes available.
Well, awesome. I all the links for that will be down in the description below. Probably when this
Yes.
video ends because they're not there yet. That way. Oh, and big, just don't click on links that you don't understand. Everything that we share, obviously double checked, but be cautious out there, family. Don't click suspicious links.
Yeah.
um, any other final thoughts there, Matt, that I haven't thought to go over that you think's valuable insight?
I think you pretty much hit on most of the high level stuff. I know this has been like a very engaging conversation from my end. I've learned a ton from you already, although I've been trying to do my best to hide my surprise or my reaction to some of it. But thank you. This has been a great conversation.
Yeah, I'm always happy to share. I ended up here by accident, but I have this vision of most people being able to develop a kind of a sovereign identity and sovereign ownership over their own assets in the future. And that's kind of my goal here. And gaming seems like one of the fastest routes. Oh, I did have one more question here.
Mm,
One of the visions that we had was the relationship between telecom companies and games.
mm.
With things like M-Pesa in Africa, where people are using the digital or data as money because it's more stable than the currency that they had. Are you guys are there any thoughts about conversations with telecommunications companies where you can play to earn for data or minutes in these, I guess, usually more in the third world countries that would adopt this? I guess when lastly also too, kind of to circle the question is just demographics. Like where are most of the community members coming from?
Yeah, with regards to telecom, it's a little challenging because we can only play it on PC right now. I don't
Right,
know
right.
I don't know what our future will look like in terms of migrating it onto mobile if we do it all. Just because Unreal Engine doesn't translate super well right now onto mobile. It's of course not impossible, but my gut instinct is we'll probably go for consoles next. Like once we're after like success after we kind of successfully launch. You have to do a little bit of tuning there, but we really need the console companies to kind of be more, they need to meet us kind of halfway with regards to how they operate around blockchain. Um, but I mean, just demographically, just I think a large portion of our player base is coming from US and China. And then it's still a somewhat of a nascent game, just like I mentioned. We're still very much in an early alpha, but South Korea has been really big, and then really places that have a large PC gamer population is probably where it's going to naturally go to next.
Yeah, this makes sense. In my mind, I just think you can play a game anywhere. I should log in and type it on any device. Well, awesome, Matthew. I'll keep you on just for a few minutes here afterwards. Bear Family, give us a thumbs up if you like this content. If you haven't done so yet, leave your thoughts, questions, comments down below. If I didn't see any of the comments that you guys left in the live stream, sorry, that's on a different screen, and I don't have time to look at it. So I apologize if you asked questions that I didn't look at. I'll try to be more on top of that in the future, I guess. But Matt, thank you. And Bear Family, see you again on the next episode. Awesome.